It started with the police scanner in my apartment crackling to life at 3:37 a.m. Normally, I'd sleep through it, but something in the dispatcher's voice froze me in place. All units, 10 to 31 at 1516 Lakewood Drive. Unidentified subject. Respond with caution. Lakewood Drive. That's 5 minutes from me. I didn't need to know what a 10 to 31 meant. It was the tone. It wasn't urgent, but it wasn't calm either. It had that edge that hinted at something off. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my jacket, told myself I'd just drive by, and headed out. By the time I got there, the flashing blue and red lights were the only signs of life on the otherwise silent street. 2 squad cars were parked outside the house. The officers stood at the curb, staring up at the windows. Their postures were rigid, as if the house itself was staring back at them. I rolled down my window and waved. "Everything all right?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity. They didn't respond. Not right away. One of them, a younger guy who couldn't have been on the force for long, finally turned to me. His face was pale. His eyes were hollow. "You should leave," he said. But I didn't. Something about the house made me park a block away and watch. It was just an old 2-story, the kind of place that's been around for decades and seen too much rain. The front yard was overgrown. The windows on the second floor were dark. But something felt wrong, like the air around it wasn't moving. I was about to give up and head home when I saw the officers finally make their move. The older one, a big guy with a graying mustache, gestured to his partner, and they both approached the door. The younger guy hesitated before stepping inside. And then it happened. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. I thought maybe I should call someone, but who? I wasn't supposed to be here. Just as I was about to drive off, the older officer stumbled out of the house. His face was a mask of pure terror. He didn't even look at the car or his partner. He just bolted, ran down the street, disappearing into the dark. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I stayed. For whatever reason, I stayed. And then I saw the younger officer. He appeared in the doorway, but he wasn't running. He wasn't moving like a man who had just walked into something horrifying. He stepped out slowly, methodically, like he was in a trance. His head tilted to the side, just slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And then he turned to me. His eyes were wrong. They were completely black. No whites, no irises. Just 2 dark, endless voids that locked onto me and froze me to my core. My breath hitched as he raised his hand and pointed directly at my car. I slammed it into reverse and peeled out of there. My heart was pounding so loud, I could barely hear myself think. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him. Still standing in the doorway, still pointing, still staring with those empty, black eyes. When I got home, I locked every door and window, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark with a baseball bat. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was a bad dream. Almost. That afternoon, I checked the news. There was nothing about Lakewood Drive. No reports of police activity. No mention of a disturbance. Nothing. It was like it never happened. I called the local precinct to ask about it, but the officer on the phone claimed he didn't know what I was talking about. Said no units were dispatched to that address last night. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I started researching the address, going through old news archives, public records, anything I could find. And what I found, well, let's just say, it's the reason I'm telling you this now. Because whatever was in that house, it's not done. It didn't take long to find out that 1516 Lakewood Drive had a history. A bad one. The house had been vacant for over 15 years. Before that, it belonged to the Hawthorne family. A quick Google search pulled up an old article from 2008. The headline read, "Hawthorne family disappears without a trace. Police investigate Lakewood Drive home." There wasn't much detail, but the story said the family of 5, parents, 2 teenagers, and a toddler, vanished overnight. No signs of a break-in, no struggle, nothing. They just ceased to exist. The case was eventually closed, chalked up to an unresolved incident. But I kept digging. On an obscure forum about paranormal investigations, someone had posted an old police report from the case. Most of it was blacked out, but a few details caught my eye. Inexplicable blood spatter on the second floor, unidentifiable symbols carved into the basement walls, and recordings from officer body cams corrupted beyond recovery. The more I read, the more I felt like something was breathing down my neck. My apartment, which had felt safe hours before, now felt vulnerable. Like the shadows in the corners were just a little darker, a little deeper. And then there were the pictures. Someone on the forum had posted a set of grainy black and white photos, allegedly taken by a crime scene investigator at the time. Most of them were standard shots, rooms, hallways, the front porch, but one of them made me freeze. It was the upstairs hallway of the house. The image was blurry, like the camera had been shaking when it was taken. At the far end of the hallway was a figure. Tall, slender, and dark. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its head too narrow, and its posture too stiff. But the worst part? It was looking at the camera, straight at it. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the screen, right into me. I slammed my laptop shut, but it was too late. The image was burned into my brain. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been marked, that whatever had been in that house knew I was looking into it. I told myself I'd drop it, but of course I didn't. Curiosity can be a curse. I decided to go back. It was a terrible idea, but I needed answers. Why were the cops there that night? Why did one of them run away like he'd seen a ghost? And why did the other look like he wasn't even human anymore? I couldn't just let it go. The next night, around 2 a.m., I drove back to Lakewood Drive. The street was dead silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. I parked a block away again, this time with the engine running, just in case. The house was dark. No lights, no movement. I sat there for 10 minutes trying to convince myself to leave, when I saw it. A figure in one of the second-floor windows. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. I stared at it, frozen, until my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. My hands shook as I opened it. All it said was, "Come inside." My gut screamed at me to drive away. Every fiber of my being knew this was wrong. But my hands, they weren't listening. They turned off the car, opened the door, and shut it behind me. My feet carried me down the street, closer and closer to the house. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. I stepped inside. The air was heavy, suffocating, like walking into a sauna. The smell hit me next. A mix of mildew, rotting wood, and something metallic. Blood? The living room was empty, but the faint sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, deliberate, and heavier than they should have been. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I crept up the staircase, every creak of the wood sounding deafening in the stillness. At the top, the hallway stretched out before me. The doors to the rooms on either side were open, revealing empty spaces. But at the end of the hallway, the door to the master bedroom was closed, and something was moving behind it, a shadow under the crack of the door. My phone buzzed again. I glanced down to see another message from the unknown number. "You shouldn't have come back." And then the door opened. It didn't open fast, no sudden jump scare, no dramatic slam. It just drifted open, slow and deliberate, like whatever was behind it wanted me to feel every inch of my fear. The room was dark, except for the pale light spilling in from the hallway. At first, I didn't see anything. Just an old bed frame, dusty furniture, and peeling wallpaper. But then my eyes adjusted. There was something in the far corner. It was crouched low, its limbs folded unnaturally, like it was too big to fit in the space it occupied. Its skin, or what I assumed was skin, was pale and waxy, stretched tight over its elongated frame. The thing's head was tilted upward, and as the light from my phone screen faintly illuminated the room, I saw its face. No, not a face, just a smooth, featureless surface. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. But I knew it was looking at me. I felt it in my bones. The air in the room grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on my chest like I was being buried alive. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as the thing began to rise. It unfolded itself, its impossibly long limbs stretching and cracking like dry wood. The ceiling wasn't high enough for it. It bent at odd angles, its movements jerky, like a marionette being controlled by a clumsy puppeteer. And then it spoke. Not with words. There was no mouth to form them. But the sound, oh God, the sound. It was in my head. A deep, resonant hum that vibrated through my skull and into my teeth. I couldn't understand the words, but they weren't meant for understanding. They were meant to break me, and they did. I stumbled backward into the hallway, my vision swimming with black spots. My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, its screen shattering on impact. The thing stepped out of the room, its head tilted as if curious about my pathetic attempt to escape. The house seemed to shift around it, the walls warping and the shadows growing darker. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I don't even remember how I got down the stairs, but I do remember the front door slamming shut just as I reached it. I threw my shoulder into it, screaming, clawing at the wood, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the sound of those heavy, deliberate footsteps filled the air. Closer, closer, and then silence. I turned, slowly, my back pressed against the door. The thing stood at the bottom of the staircase, its head tilted again in that mockery of human curiosity. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at me, the featureless surface of its face glowing faintly in the dim light. And then it spoke again. This time I understood. You brought them here. Before I could process the words, the door behind me flew open, and I tumbled backward onto the porch. Cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. I scrambled to my feet, turning back to look at the house. But the door was already shut. The windows were dark. It was like nothing had happened. I drove straight home, my hands trembling so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. Once I was inside, I locked every door, every window, and shoved furniture against them for good measure. But it didn't help. I could still feel it. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, I checked the news again. Still nothing about the house. No mention of the cops, the officers, or me. But as I scrolled through my phone, I noticed something. My photo gallery had a new album. It was titled 1516. Inside were dozens of photos of me, sitting in my car outside the house, standing on the porch, walking up the stairs, and the last one was of me, taken from the hallway as I stared into the master bedroom. I deleted the album, smashed the phone, and bought a new one the same day. But I know it doesn't matter, because tonight, when I looked out my window, there was a man standing across the street. No features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale face. And he was looking right at me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blank, featureless face staring back at me. I sat on my couch, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every little creak and groan my apartment made. The man across the street didn't move. Hours passed, but he just stood there, motionless, like he was waiting for something or someone. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the blinds, I finally worked up the courage to look outside again. He was gone. The street was empty. I should have felt relieved, but instead, the dread only grew. He wasn't out there anymore. Where was he? By noon, I decided I couldn't handle this alone. I wasn't some hardened horror protagonist. I was just a guy who'd made a terrible decision to snoop around where he didn't belong. I needed help. The police were obviously out of the question. I couldn't exactly walk into a precinct and say, "Hey, there's a faceless man stalking me because I visited some haunted murder house. Can you help?" No, I needed someone who might actually believe me. That's when I remembered her, Emily Carter. She ran a paranormal YouTube channel I'd stumbled across a year ago. Most of her stuff was clickbait garbage. Real ghost caught on camera, proof of Bigfoot in Nevada, that kind of thing, but she had a knack for investigating urban legends. If anyone would know about Lakewood Drive, it'd be her. I found her contact info in the description of one of her videos and sent a desperate email, explaining everything. To my surprise, she responded within the hour. "Meet me at Moonbeam Coffee. Tonight. 7 p.m. When I arrived, Emily was already waiting. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, with messy blonde hair and a laptop covered in stickers. She waved me over, her expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "So," she said, tapping her fingers on the table as I sat down, "you're the guy who poked the bear at 1516 Lakewood. Bold move. You've heard of it?" I asked, relieved. "Of course I've heard of it," she said, lowering her voice. "It's one of the most infamous haunted locations in the state. But no one's been dumb enough to actually go inside for years." "Well, I guess I broke that streak," I muttered. "And now I think something's following me." Her eyes lit up, not with excitement, but with the seriousness of someone who finally had a lead on something real. "Tell me everything," she said. I recounted the entire story, from the police scanner to the messages on my phone, to the man standing outside my apartment. As I spoke, her face grew paler, her expression more grim. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. "You're not being followed by a ghost," she said. "This is something much worse." "Worse? What could be worse than a ghost?" Emily opened her laptop and started typing, pulling up a grainy old photo of the same faceless figure I'd seen in the hallway of 1516 Lakewood. "This thing," she said, pointing at the screen, "is what's known as a harbinger. It doesn't just haunt people. It marks them. Once it's chosen you, it doesn't stop." "Stop what?" I asked, my throat dry. "Replacing you." Emily explained that harbingers were like scouts. They didn't kill people outright. They prepared them. Slowly, methodically, they'd strip away your identity, your routines, your relationships, even your memories, until there was nothing left of you. And then, when the time was right, they'd take your place. "No one ever notices," she said, "because you'll look the same, act the same, but whatever comes out isn't you." I stared at her, horrified. "How do I stop it?" Her face darkened. "You don't." I slammed my fist on the table, drawing a few startled glances from the other customers. "There's got to be something. A ritual, a spell, something. You're telling me I'm just supposed to sit here and wait for this thing to take me?" Emily hesitated, then leaned in close. "There is one way," she said, "but you're not going to like it. The solution, if you could call it that, involved going back to the source. The Harbinger's power was tied to 1516 Lakewood, and the only way to sever the connection was to confront it there. Not just the Harbinger, the entity it served. The thing that made the house what it was. Emily called it the root. Destroy the root, she said, and you might have a chance, but you won't be the same after. Why? I asked, dreading the answer. Because the root knows you now. It knows everything about you. Your fears, your secrets, the things you hate about yourself. It'll use all of that against you. And if you're not strong enough... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. By the time I left the coffee shop, I felt like I'd signed my own death warrant. I was going back to the house that night. Emily had agreed to come with me, though I could tell she wasn't thrilled about it. As I drove home to prepare, my phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "It's waiting for you." For the first time, I responded. "I'm coming." The drive to 1516 Lakewood felt like a march toward my own execution. Emily sat beside me, unusually quiet, clutching a backpack filled with gear. Flashlights, cameras, and a small pouch of powder she claimed was for emergencies. I didn't ask what kind of emergencies required mysterious powder. My brain was already fried. We parked a block away just like I had before. The street was dead silent, the air heavy and oppressive. The house loomed in the distance, dark and lifeless, yet somehow alive. Emily broke the silence. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she tightened the straps on her backpack. "No," I admitted, "but I don't think I have a choice." She nodded, pulling a small recorder out of her pocket. "We document everything. No matter what happens, someone needs to know what went down here." Her words didn't make me feel any better. If anything, they made the stakes feel even higher. The front door was still ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. As we stepped inside, the familiar smell of mildew and decay hit me like a brick. Emily shone her flashlight around the living room, revealing warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it watching us, pressing down on us like an invisible weight. "Where's the root?" I whispered. Emily paused, scanning the room. "If the lore is right, it's in the basement. That's where it always is." The basement. Of course it had to be the basement. We made our way through the house, the floorboards groaning beneath our feet. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe, but when I looked closer, nothing was there. Emily muttered under her breath, something about psychic feedback and manifestations, but I was too focused on the growing sense of dread to ask what she meant. We found the basement door at the back of the kitchen. It was slightly ajar, revealing a set of stairs that descended into pure darkness. Emily handed me a flashlight, her expression grim. "You go first," she said. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," I muttered, but I took the lead anyway. The steps creaked under my weight, the sound echoing unnaturally in the narrow space. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time we reached the bottom, I could see my breath. Emily's flashlight flickered as we stepped into the basement, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And that's when I saw them. Symbols. Dozens of them, carved into the concrete walls, pulsating with a faint, sickly light. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Alien and organic, like they were alive. Emily gasped, her voice trembling. "These are wards," she said. "Or no, corrupted wards. Someone tried to seal this thing, but it turned their own magic against them." I didn't care what they were. I cared about the figure standing in the middle of the room. It was the Harbinger. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side, as if studying us. Its faceless head glowed faintly in the dark, and its limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers twitching like they had a mind of their own. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, something massive shifted in the shadows. I couldn't make out its shape, but I felt its presence. A deep, crushing malevolence that sucked the air from my lungs. This was the root, the source of everything. The root began to move. Emily grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the stairs. "We're not ready for this," she hissed. But the Harbinger was already blocking our escape. It stepped forward, its movements smooth and deliberate, as if it knew exactly how to keep us cornered. Behind it, the root slithered closer, its form twisting and shifting in the dark like smoke with weight. Emily fumbled with her backpack, pulling out the pouch of powder. She threw a handful of it toward the Harbinger, shouting words in a language I didn't recognize. The powder ignited mid-air, bursting into a bright, white flame that lit up the basement. The Harbinger recoiled, its featureless face twisting in an expression I didn't think was possible. Rage. But the root didn't stop. It surged forward, and for the first time I saw its true form. It was a mass of writhing, black tendrils, each one ending in a jagged, claw-like tip. At its center was a pulsating core, glowing with an otherworldly light that made my head throb just looking at it. I knew then that we weren't leaving this basement alive. "Get to the core," Emily shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening hum that filled the room. "Destroy it." "How?" I screamed back, dodging a tendril that lashed out at me, splintering the concrete wall. "I don't know. Just do something." The Harbinger lunged at her, its long fingers swiping through the air, but she dodged, throwing another handful of powder in its direction. I made a break for the root, weaving through the tendrils as they whipped around me. When I reached the core, I raised the flashlight and slammed it down with all my strength. The glass shattered, the light flickered, and for a split second, the entire room went silent. And then the screaming started. It wasn't human screaming, not from a throat, not something lungs could produce. It was the sound of the root itself, a high-pitched, metallic wail that reverberated through my skull and made me drop to my knees. The light from its core exploded outward in jagged pulses, illuminating the basement in bursts of white and black like a strobe light. The walls shook, and those carved symbols on the concrete began to glow violently, bleeding light. The harbinger let out a guttural roar. It was no longer calm, no longer composed. It moved erratically, clawing at its own head as if the sound was unbearable even to it. Emily, on the other side of the room, was shouting something, but I couldn't hear her over the deafening shriek of the root. The core was still intact, pulsating wildly, its light dimming and brightening like a failing heartbeat. I knew I had to finish it, but with what? My hands were empty, trembling and slick with sweat. My flashlight was in pieces on the ground. Then I remembered my pocket knife. I fumbled for it, pulling it out with clumsy, shaking hands. The tendrils of the root lashed out, whipping against the floor and walls, one barely missing me by inches. I lunged forward, raising the knife, and drove it into the core with everything I had. The wailing stopped. The basement went dark. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence and darkness, like the entire world had been swallowed by the void. Then, a low rumble began to build, deep and guttural, shaking the ground beneath me. A crack of light split through the core, spreading outward like shattered glass. The tendrils began to convulse, retracting and thrashing wildly as the root started to collapse in on itself. The harbinger let out another inhuman howl, its body contorting violently. It turned toward me, its featureless face twisting in a way that sent ice through my veins. And then it was gone. Not dead, not destroyed, just gone. Like it had been yanked out of reality itself. The root followed. The tendrils crumbled into ash, the core disintegrating into nothingness. The light from the symbols faded, leaving the basement in a suffocating blackness. For a moment, I thought I'd been left alone in the dark, but then Emily's flashlight clicked on. She helped me to my feet, her face pale and her breathing ragged. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I think so," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. We climbed the stairs in silence, the house around us eerily still. When we reached the front door, the oppressive air that had surrounded the house was gone. It felt lighter, emptier, like whatever had been here was finally gone. But as we stepped outside, Emily grabbed my arm. "Wait!" I turned to her, confused, but her eyes weren't on me. They were on the street. "Look," she said, pointing. Standing in the middle of the road was a man. Tall, motionless, with a smooth, pale face. No features, no eyes, no mouth. The harbinger. "Run!" Emily screamed, shoving me toward the car. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the street, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, feel him, getting closer with every step. We reached the car, and I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as Emily jumped into the passenger side. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as we sped down the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The harbinger was standing in the middle of the street, motionless once again, watching us drive away. We didn't stop until we were miles from Lakewood Drive. We pulled into an empty parking lot, both of us too shaken to speak. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. "What was that?" I finally asked, my voice cracking. "I thought the route was destroyed. I thought it was over." Emily didn't answer right away. She stared out the window, her face pale and haunted. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, fear. "The route's gone," she said. "But the harbinger? It wasn't bound to the route. It serves something older, something worse." My stomach dropped. "So what now?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but it marked you. That doesn't just go away." I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers, but I knew she was right. The route was gone, but the harbinger wasn't. It wasn't done with me. And as we sat there in that empty parking lot, I got one final message on my phone. The same unknown number. "This is only the beginning." Emily and I sat in that parking lot for what felt like hours. The message on my phone stared back at me. The words burned into my brain. "This is only the beginning." My hands trembled as I set the phone down, not sure if I wanted to throw it out the window or keep it close in case something worse was coming. Emily finally broke the silence. "You need to leave," she said. I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean? Leave where?" "Everywhere," she said, her voice steady but hollow. "Go off the grid. Change your name, your location. Stop using your phone, your credit cards, anything that ties you to this place, to who you are. The Harbinger marked you. It knows everything about you, and it won't stop until it finishes what it started." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're saying I need to just run? Forever?" Emily nodded. "For now, yes. There are people out there, groups, networks, that deal with things like this. I can help you find them, but you can't stay here. It's not safe." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. This wasn't over. Whatever had been unleashed at 1516 Lakewood was still tied to me, and staying in one place would only make it easier for the Harbinger to find me, to finish me. But I couldn't just disappear overnight. There were things I needed to do, people I needed to warn. And I still didn't understand why this was happening to me in the first place. Emily dropped me off at my apartment, against her better judgment. "One night," she said firmly. "Pack what you can. Burn what you can't. I'll come for you tomorrow." I promised her I'd be ready, but as I stepped into my apartment, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt wrong. The air was heavy, the shadows darker than they should have been. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb was out. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but before I could, a faint sound stopped me in my tracks. Footsteps. Inside the apartment. My heart pounded as I crept toward the source of the noise. The living room was empty, the furniture exactly where I'd left it. The kitchen, too. But when I turned toward the hallway leading to my bedroom, I saw it. The figure, standing at the end of the hall. It wasn't the Harbinger. This figure was smaller, human-sized. I couldn't make out its features in the dim light, but it was wearing my clothes. A hoodie I hadn't worn in weeks. Jeans with a tear in the knee. It tilted its head, mimicking the same eerie motion the Harbinger had in the basement. And then it spoke. Not with a voice, but with my voice. "You shouldn't have come back." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be me. Could it? The thing stepped forward, its movements stiff and unnatural, like it was still learning how to use its limbs. What are you?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. It smiled. My smile. Crooked, hesitant, but unmistakably mine. "You already know," it said. "I'm what's left when you're gone." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a copy of me, it was my replacement. The Harbinger hadn't been waiting to destroy me. It had been preparing this thing to take my place. The doppelganger took another step forward, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. Out the front door, down the stairs, and into the street. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the door locked and the engine running. I looked back at the apartment, expecting to see the figure chasing me, but the doorway was empty. The building looked normal, silent, like it had always been. But I knew better. I didn't go back inside. I didn't sleep. I drove aimlessly for hours, circling the city, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. By morning, I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about pulling over, I saw that thing's face, my face, staring back at me. Emily called around noon, asking if I was ready to leave. I told her what had happened, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "This is worse than I thought," she finally said. "It's already started." "What started?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "The replacement. The Harbinger isn't just marking you. It's replacing you. That thing in your apartment. It's going to live your life. Take your job, your friends, everything. And no one will notice. No one except you." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "Then what do we do?" Her voice was grim. "We find the people who can stop this. The ones who deal with things like the Harbinger. But we have to move fast. Once it finishes replacing you, it won't need to keep you alive." That night, I left the city with nothing but a duffel bag and a burner phone Emily had given me. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Couldn't. The thing wearing my face was still out there, walking around in my clothes, living my life. And me? I was a ghost, running from something I didn't fully understand, with no idea if I'd ever be free of it. But as we drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just following me anymore. It was inside me, waiting, growing. And one day, when I wasn't paying attention, it would finish what it started. Emily and I drove for hours, leaving the city far behind. The highway stretched endlessly into the dark, our only company the occasional semi-truck rumbling past. I was exhausted, barely keeping my eyes open, but every time I drifted, I saw it. The harbinger, the thing wearing my face, waiting for me to slip, to let it in. Emily noticed. "You're fading," she said, glancing over at me. "We'll stop soon. I know a place." "Where?" My voice was hoarse. I hadn't spoken much since we left the city. "There's a safe house," she said. "A friend of mine, well, someone in the network, runs it. It's off the grid, but they'll know what to do. They've dealt with things like this before." I didn't have the energy to argue. I just nodded and kept driving, hoping she was right. The safe house turned out to be a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. We had to park the car and hike the last stretch, guided by the faint light of Emily's flashlight. The forest was silent, unnervingly so, like even the animals knew to stay away. When we reached the cabin, a tall man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek was waiting for us on the porch. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just gave us a curt nod and stepped aside to let us in. Inside, the place was sparse but functional. No electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove, a few cots, and shelves lined with books and strange artifacts. The man finally spoke as he shut the door behind us. "Name's Grant," he said, his voice gravelly. "Emily says you've got a harbinger problem." "Yeah," I said, collapsing onto one of the cots. "That's one way to put it." Grant studied me for a moment, his sharp blue eyes practically dissecting me. "You look like hell. How long's it been following you?" "Since I went into the house," I said. 1516 Lakewood. At that, his expression darkened. "You went there?" He exchanged a glance with Emily, who nodded grimly. "Figured you'd say that," Grant muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right, rest up. We'll deal with this in the morning." I didn't sleep much that night. The cabin was too quiet, too isolated. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept expecting to see the harbinger, or worse, my doppelganger, standing in the corner watching me, but the real terror came just before dawn. I woke to the sound of whispers, faint, barely audible, like a dozen voices murmuring just out of reach. At first, I thought it was Emily or Grant, but when I sat up, I realized the whispers were coming from outside. I crept to the window, my breath fogging the glass, and peered out into the darkness. The forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then I saw them, figures, dozens of them scattered among the trees. Some were tall and thin, others hunched and distorted, their bodies twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. Their faces, if they had faces, were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. "Emily!" I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. "Grant!" Emily was already awake, sitting up on her cot with a knife in her hand. "What is it?" I pointed to the window, my voice shaking. "They're out there." Grant was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a shotgun from the corner of the room. He moved to the window and pulled back the curtain, just enough to peek outside. His face hardened. "Shit! What?" Emily demanded, standing beside him. "They're here," Grant said. "Projections. They're not fully manifested yet, but they're close." "Projections?" I asked, my voice rising. "What does that mean?" "It means the Harbinger's not alone anymore," Emily said, her expression grim. "It's calling for help." We barricaded the cabin as best we could, nailing planks of wood over the windows and shoving furniture against the doors. Grant poured a circle of salt around the perimeter, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a warning. "They won't come in unless you invite them," he said, handing me a shotgun. "But if they get close enough, they'll try to make you. Don't listen to anything they say." "Great," I muttered, gripping the shotgun like a lifeline. "This just keeps getting better." The whispers grew louder as the night wore on, a constant, insidious hum that seemed to worm its way into my skull. At times, I thought I heard my own voice among them, calling out from the darkness. "Let me in," it said. "You're tired. You're scared. Just let me in." I clenched my jaw, trying to block it out, but the whispers kept coming, relentless and unyielding. And then, just before sunrise, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, that fills your ears with the sound of your own heartbeat. I glanced at Emily and Grant, both of them tense, their eyes fixed on the door. Something was coming. Something big. The first blow came without warning. The door shook violently, the wood splintering under the force. Grant raised his shotgun, barking for us to stay back. The second blow sent cracks spiderwebbing through the planks. And then we saw it. The Harbinger stood in the doorway, its featureless face glowing faintly in the dim light. Behind it, the projections lurked, their twisted forms writhing like shadows made flesh. The Harbinger raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at me. "It's time," it said, in a voice that was mine and yet not mine. And the door exploded inward. The force of the explosion threw me backward, slamming me into the wall. The shotgun slipped from my hands, clattering across the floor. My ears rang, and for a moment, all I could see were the swirling shadows spilling into the cabin, twisting and writhing like smoke with weight. The Harbinger stepped inside, its head tilting slightly as it surveyed the room. Behind it, the projections flowed in like a tide, their distorted forms barely clinging to the edges of reality. They moved wrong, jolting, stuttering, as if they were being dragged by unseen strings. Grant didn't hesitate. He raised his shotgun and fired point-blank into the Harbinger's chest. The blast tore through it, but the Harbinger didn't even flinch. It turned its faceless head toward him, and for a moment, I thought I heard it laugh, soft and hollow, like the echo of wind in a crypt. "Asterisk bullets won't save you, asterisk," it said, in a voice that sounded like it was made of static. "Good thing I brought other tricks," Grant growled. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a vial of dark, viscous liquid. Before I could ask what it was, he hurled it at the Harbinger. The glass shattered on impact, and the liquid ignited, engulfing the Harbinger in flames. It screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that made my teeth ache, and staggered back, its limbs flailing as the fire consumed it. "Salt the doorframe," Grant shouted, turning to Emily. "Keep the projections out." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed a bag of salt and sprinted to the door, pouring a thick line across the threshold. The projections hissed and recoiled as the salt touched them, their forms flickering like dying flames. But the Harbinger wasn't finished. It clawed at the flames, tearing the burning remnants of its form away like a snake shedding its skin. Beneath the fire, its body twisted and reshaped itself, growing larger, darker, more monstrous. Its arms stretched, its limbs contorting into grotesque, jagged shapes. "What the hell is that?" I gasped, struggling to my feet. "That's what it really looks like," Emily said, her voice shaking. "It's shedding the mask." The Harbinger lunged, its massive claws swiping at Grant. He dove out of the way, but the creature's momentum carried it straight toward me. I scrambled for the shotgun, barely managing to raise it as the Harbinger loomed over me. I fired. The blast hit its shoulder, tearing away a chunk of its flesh or whatever it was made of. It reared back, letting out another piercing wail, and I used the moment to crawl backward, putting as much distance between us as I could. "Get to the circle," Grant yelled. "The salt will hold it." I didn't question him. I bolted toward the perimeter of the room, where the salt circle glowed faintly in the dim light. Emily was already there, her knife drawn, her eyes darting between the Harbinger and the projections clawing at the doorway. "Now what?" I shouted, my voice raw with panic. Now we hold the line, Grant said, stepping into the circle beside us. He raised his shotgun, aiming at the Harbinger as it stalked toward us, its massive form blotting out the light. Whatever happens, don't leave the circle. The next few minutes, or maybe hours, were a blur of chaos. The Harbinger attacked again and again, each strike shaking the cabin to its foundations. The projections pressed against the salt lines, their forms shimmering and flickering like static on an old TV screen. Grant fought like a man possessed, firing shell after shell at the Harbinger, each shot buying us a few precious seconds. Emily threw more of her powder, creating bursts of light that sent the projections scattering. I stood in the center of the circle, clutching the shotgun like a lifeline, too terrified to move. And then, the Harbinger did something I hadn't expected. It stopped. For a moment, the cabin was still. The Harbinger stood at the edge of the circle, its massive form writhing like smoke. Its featureless face turned toward me, and I felt its gaze, cold, unyielding, and impossibly ancient. You cannot run forever, it said, its voice a deep, resonant hum that shook the air. You are already mine. My heart stopped. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The Harbinger raised one clawed hand, pointing directly at me. Do you hear it? It asked. The calling. And then I did. A faint whisper at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. It was my voice, calling out from the void, repeating the same words over and over. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. The world tilted. My vision blurred. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out everything else. I felt myself swaying, my feet moving toward the edge of the circle, toward the Harbinger's outstretched hand. Stop him! Emily screamed. Grant tackled me, dragging me back into the circle just as my foot crossed the salt line. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. I gasped for air, my chest heaving, as the Harbinger let out a low, rumbling growl. You are weak, it said. You will fall. And then it was gone. The projections, the whispers, the crushing sense of dread. All of it vanished, leaving the cabin eerily quiet. What the hell just happened? I whispered, staring at the spot where the Harbinger had stood. It's not over, Grant said, helping me to my feet. That was just a warning. Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. It'll come back. It always does. I looked between them, my pulse still racing. Then what do we do? Grant's expression hardened. We prepare. Because next time, it's not leaving until it gets what it came for. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear the whisper. Soft, persistent. Asterisk, let me in. Asterisk, the days that followed were a blur. Grant and Emily didn't waste a second. They worked tirelessly, preparing for the inevitable return of the Harbinger. The cabin became a fortress. Wards scrawled in chalk and ash lined every wall. Salt circles were reinforced, and strange sigils were burned into the floor. I helped where I could, but my mind was elsewhere. The whisper, it hadn't stopped. At first it was faint, easy to ignore. But with each passing day, it grew louder, more insistent, clawing at the edges of my mind. Asterisk, let me in. Let me in. Let me in. Asterisk, it followed me into my dreams, echoed in the silence, and sometimes I swore it was my own voice saying it out loud. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. While Emily and Grant were outside setting up additional wards, I sat alone in the cabin, staring at the shotgun across my lap. My hands trembled as the whisper grew deafening, drilling into my skull like a relentless hammer. And then it stopped. The silence was so sudden it made me dizzy. I stood, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. That's when I noticed the shadows in the corner of the room. Deeper, darker than they should have been. It was here. The Harbinger stepped out of the shadows, its towering form hunched beneath the low ceiling. Its featureless face glowed faintly, casting an eerie light over the room. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking, but it didn't move. It just stood there, tilting its head like it was amused. "You are tired," it said, its voice low and resonant. "You cannot fight me. Stay back," I said, though my voice wavered. "I'll shoot." It took a step closer, unbothered by the threat. "I do not need to fight you," it said. "You are already mine. You have felt it. The whisper. The calling." The whisper surged back, louder than ever, and I dropped the shotgun, clutching my head. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as the harbinger loomed over me. "All you must do," it said, "is let me in." The door to the cabin burst open, and Grant stormed in, shotgun blazing. The blast hit the harbinger square in the chest, and it let out a deafening roar, staggering backward. Emily followed close behind, throwing a pouch of her mysterious powder at the creature. The air ignited in a blinding flash, forcing the harbinger to retreat into the shadows. "Get up," Grant shouted, hauling me to my feet. "It's trying to break you." I nodded weakly, my head pounding. "It's in my head," I gasped. "I can't stop it." Emily grabbed my face, forcing me to look at her. "You have to," she said firmly. "If you give in, it wins. Do you understand? It wins." Before I could respond. The shadows in the room began to writhe and expand, filling every corner with darkness. The harbinger's voice echoed from all around us, deep and mocking. "You cannot save him," it said. "He belongs to me." The cabin trembled as the harbinger emerged again, its form larger and more grotesque than before. Tendrils of shadow lashed out, shattering furniture and knocking Emily and Grant to the ground. I stood frozen, the whisper screaming in my head, drowning out everything else. "Let me in," it said. "Let me in." And then something snapped. I screamed, louder than I thought possible, drowning out the whisper, the harbinger, everything. The pain in my head reached a breaking point, and for a moment the world seemed to crack. The shadows froze, and the harbinger tilted its head, as if surprised. "No," I said through gritted teeth, my voice shaking but firm. "You don't get to win. Not tonight." I grabbed the shotgun from the floor and aimed it at the harbinger. But this time I didn't fire. Instead, I stepped forward, crossing the line of salt that had protected me until now. "Hey!" Grant shouted. "What are you doing?" "Ending this?" I said, never taking my eyes off the harbinger. The creature hesitated, its tendrils twitching as if unsure of my intent. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, the weight of its ancient, otherworldly malice. But I didn't stop. I stepped closer, my grip tightening on the shotgun. "You want me?" I said. "Then come and get me." The harbinger roared, its form surging toward me in a wave of darkness. But this time I was ready. I raised the shotgun, aimed at its glowing core, the faint, pulsing light at the center of its being, and pulled the trigger. The explosion wasn't like before. The blast tore through the harbinger, ripping it apart from the inside out. Its scream shook the cabin, rattling the walls and shattering the windows. The shadows convulsed, then imploded, collapsing inward until they were gone. And then, silence. I opened my eyes to find Emily and Grant staring at me, their faces a mix of shock and relief. The cabin was in ruins, but the oppressive weight that had filled the air was gone. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "For now." Grant stepped forward, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said. "You sent it back." "But not for good," Emily added, her expression somber. "Things like the harbinger don't die. They just retreat. Someday, it'll find someone else." I nodded, my body heavy with exhaustion. "But not me," I said. "Not anymore." We left the cabin at dawn, the forest bathed in golden light. The whisper was gone. The harbinger was gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. But as we reached the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see a figure in the window. There was nothing, just shadows. For now.